I should note that I'm following Jeremy. For those of you who are here for the last exciting episode of Texas Enterprise, Jeremy spoke, and of course he's a hard act to follow. I mean, he was able to evoke the great names of the past, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Churchill. He discussed his personal meetings with Henry Kissinger, talked about the momentous events in history, the world wars and such. I by contrast, can do nothing more than evoke the head of the Social Security Administration or the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. The title of my talk today, Americans Living Rich, Retiring Poor, is somewhat disingenuous. The fact of the matter is, I'm only going to focus on the latter part of that, the living poor part. In looking at the issues of retirement, we have to take a holistic view. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on the various sources of wealth and income, savings, pensions, Social Security. But in fact, as I'll suggest, we really have to emphasize that the problems go considerably beyond that. They involve trends in healthcare, the debt and deficits of our governments at all levels, and indeed, most importantly, the overall factors affecting the U.S. economy. I believe that you are entitled to some party favors if you're here today. So what I've provided for you, and I hope you'll pick up on your way out, is a copy of the Citizen's Guide, or a citizen-centric report of the U.S. government. Believe it or not, federal accounting is not an oxymoron. And the accounting is quite rigorous, and I think if you look at that report, you'll see it's quite honest, far more so, in fact, than any corporate report. In big letters, it will say, at least in the main report, it will say the U.S. government is not fiscally sustainable, and it makes that case pretty strongly. And I'll talk about that a bit later today. Well, I'd like to start off with the good news. And the good news is, and this is about the only good news today, is that you're going to be living longer than your parents or your grandparents. If you were born in 1940, you had a life expectancy, if you're a male, of about 61, females 56. I guess it was a bit lower for females because there was probably deaths in childbirth. 1960, you had a life expectancy of 66. 2012, it's now up to 76 for males, 81 for females. And if you're now 65, you can expect to live, if you're a man, till about 83. If you're a woman, till about 85. And the fact is that lots of us are retiring at increasing rates. In fact, more than 10,000 Americans are retiring every day. And notice that the largest line, this was 2012. And you can see it's increasing over time. And of course, that is going to be a major concern of ours today. Further, the problem that we have is that more of us are retiring and therefore not working, and fewer of us are working. Look at the ratio of workers to retirees in that last column. In 1950, we had 7 workers for every retiree. Now it's down to a little over 4. The projection out for the next 60 years or so, it's going to go down even further, down to 2 workers for every two workers for every retiree. Just to put things in perspective for our talks today, let us note that the median income in the United States, this is median household income, is a little over $50,000. Keep that in mind. That means that about half the households are earning considerably less than that. When it comes to retirees, however, the situation is obviously much worse. Now, this is the average income, and I just want to focus, on this top number over here. Total income on average, based, 2010, it's a little bit higher now, obviously, is about $28,000. Now, where do they get all that income? The largest part, 39%, is from Social Security. Next comes some sort of pension. Now, the other large item is earnings. This happens to be based on all people over 65, so it's an average. Many of them are working. Obviously, those who are retired, the earnings is a much smaller portion. The situation for women is much worse than that for men. The median income for the number for men, I said here it says 25,000. The other slide said 28,000. One is an average, one is a median. They're probably not measured exactly the same way, but I think they make the same point, and that is that for retirees, in both cases, they're not very well off. The median income for men is 25,000. For women, about 15,000. And in other words, women are only getting about 60% of the, have only about 60% of the earnings of men. Studies have indicated that for all income groups, particularly the lower income groups, they are at risk with respect to income. Now, what do we mean by at risk? What they've done here is they have figured out how much people earn pre-retirement. And then they said, well, there's a replacement rate. If you retire, you don't need your full income. Perhaps you need 75 or 80% of your income. So they took that. And then they said, well, is the actual income going to be more than 10% less than that replacement rate? And so notice, and they made this study in 2010, but then they redid it in 2013 because the stock market went up and housing prices went up in that period. So, but what do they find? That 50% of people over 65 and over, are at risk. You go to the low income group, and it's far more than that, 60%. Obviously, high income, it's somewhat less. But do people have any reserves? And the answer is no. The net worth, the average net worth, the median net worth, I should say, of households, not individuals, households, is $104,000. But that takes into account their homes. Take out their homes, and their net worth goes down to $8,480. Forget about the numbers below that, because obviously that doesn't add up to $104,000, and I couldn't figure this out. I called somebody at the Census Bureau, and what they explained was that, for example, the $25,000 for stocks is if people have stocks. Among those who have stocks, the median value is $25,000. Have they other savings? Have they savings at all? The answer is no. 31% of the population over 65 has less than $1,000 in savings. Now, this excludes their homes, and it excludes any pensions that they might have. 47%, therefore, have less than $10,000 in saving. So the picture in that regard is not terribly bright. And you think they own their homes outright? Not quite right. They still have mortgages. 39% of the population over 65 still have mortgages, and the average amount, the median debt of those mortgages is something over $50,000, about $51,000. So they don't have very much money, and worse yet, they don't have a clue as to how much it's going to take to retire. The surveys indicated that something like 30%, look at this first group over over here, something like something like 30%, about 29% are convinced that they'll need less than $250,000 total in assets to retire. In fact, I've just did a little rough calculation, and I said, let's suppose that you and your spouse both earn $50,000. Your household income is over $100,000. $100,000 would put you among the top earners in the country, probably in the top 10%, I imagine. Now, let's suppose that you expect to retire at age 65 and you'll live for another 25 years. And let's say that your replacement rate is 75%. That is to say, although your current income was $100,000 combined, you figure when you retire, you can get by on a little bit less, say $75,000. And let's suppose that you expect to earn a real return of 3%. What I mean is a real return that excludes any impact of inflation. 3% is very high. That's probably 1.5% is probably a much more realistic real income. And let's suppose also that you'll receive, let's say, pick the number $37,578 in Social Security. Upon your retirement, you'll not need $250,000, you'll need $651,000 approximately. If we take a more realistic rate of return, let's say 1.5%, that number goes up to $775,000. So the point is you need a lot. But Americans today, I think at least some of them don't feel too comfortable with their retirement. If you look at this, look at the trend over time, you'll see that since about 2008, it's been going down pretty fast. What these colors indicate is how many people are not confident, are somewhat confident, or very confident. The point is that for those who are not very confident, that number is decreasing. So people are not terribly confident about their retirement. Now, that deals with the savings that people have. Now, what about pensions? Here we've seen a dramatic shift in the last 20 or 30 years. This first group over here indicates the percentage of workers who participate in pension plans, who already have some retirement plans. At one point, something like 80% of the employees who had pension plans were in defined benefit plans. Today, by contrast, and only 21% were in defined contribution plans. Today, that number has reversed itself. Virtually no companies today, no new companies, no startups are establishing defined benefit plans. All of them are establishing defined contribution plans, and any corporation that can shift is shifting from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. Now let's make sure that we know the distinction between the two. In a defined contribution plan, as the name suggests, it's the contributions that are defined. That is to say, the employer will say, we will put aside a certain amount of dollars into an account, into your personal account. In other words, the employer may say, we will put aside 6% of your salary. Or they may say, we will match you. Anything that you put up, we will match up to 6% of the salary. So they put that in your personal account. You can take that account anywhere you want. If you change employers, that account moves with you. But now, here's the thing. You typically have some options as how that money is invested. If the investment does well, you're the beneficiary. If it does poorly, then you're the one who suffers the loss. For example, My pension at the University of Texas is in a defined contribution plan with TIA-CREF. If it does well, then I'm in great shape. If it does not, the only thing I can do is go up to the tower and say, please, President Powers, a few alms for a very loyal and dedicated professor. By contrast, in a defined benefit plan, the benefits are defined. Now, the employer will say to you, we promise you that upon retirement, we will pay you certain benefits. For example, they may say, upon your retirement, we will pay you 2% of your salary for the last year or 3 years, 2% of your salary for every year that you've been employed. So if you've been employed for 30 years, you'll now get 60% of your salary. Fact is that overall, most workers today, have no retirement plan. These are 2008 data. It hasn't changed very much. 31% participated only in a 401k type plan. That's a defined contribution plan. 3% total workers participated only in a defined benefit plan. Some small number participated in both. If we're looking at defined benefit plans today, they are associated mainly with the public sector, with government organizations. If you had a defined benefit plan with a corporation, not doing badly, I doubt if you can see the numbers up there, but what this suggests is that for the most part, the corporate plans are reasonably well funded. They have enough money to pay out, to make the promised benefits. And if you project out and the stock market does well, it looks like they're in good shape for the future. But what is noticeable, though, notice that the funding in these plans goes up and down. In other words, it goes up and down with the stock market. Well, today, the stock market is doing pretty well, so our corporate plans are also doing reasonably well. But here's the problem with our 401k plans. This indicates the median balances in the plans. So let's look at extremely wealthy salaried employees, those who earn over $100,000. As I said, $100,000, that's the upper crust of workers in America by any statistical measures. The median balance among those who are in their 60s, in other words, just about at retirement age, is about $300,000. $300,000 does not go very far. If somebody 65 is going to live, I have to count on this, perhaps another 30 years, a $300,000 invested at 6% will provide an annuity for 30 years of $21,800. Nowhere near the $100,000 that they're used to earning, and even coupled with Social Security, is not going to allow them to live the lifestyle that they've become accustomed to or that they probably expect. But let's go down. That's $100,000. Let's look at. We said the median income in this country is about $50,000. So let's go over here. Now those who are approaching retirement have $85,000. What does $85,000 get for you? That gives you a little over $6,000 per year. $500 per month. That's not a great retirement. And the reality is that employees simply do not take full advantage of 401k plans. One study by a private group indicated that of those who can participate in 401k plans, and that's a defined contribution plan, about greater than 70% participated in some manner, but fewer than 10% contributed the maximum that they could, and more than half didn't take full advantage of the employer match. And then, as I indicated, in many of these plans, the employees have considerable flexibility as to how they invest their funds, but 53% of the companies, or I should say only 53%, provide meaningful investment advice. Now, why then are these plans so popular? Well, the employers love it. Why do the employers love it? Because they are now transferring the risk to the employees. And from an accounting perspective, they're off the hook. They have nothing further to worry about. Therefore, they don't have to report a balance, they don't have to report a liability on their balance sheets. They don't have to report revenues, and I shouldn't say revenues, they don't have to report expenses which are exceedingly volatile and which will be affected by the behavior of the stock market. So they don't have to worry about that. Further, they don't have to worry about rather burdensome federal regulations, most of which are incorporated into ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. From the employee standpoint, these have a major advantage in that they're portable. You're not stuck with one employer. If you leave the employer, you can take your money with you and still have the benefits of the investment. However, having said that, if you speak to any actuary, what they will tell you is this: that the best defined contribution plan is less efficient than the worst defined benefit plan. Now, why is that? Let's think about that for a moment. Let's suppose that you're 65 years old. How many more years are you going to live? God willing, you'll live 30, maybe 35 more years. That means that you have to save enough to last you for perhaps 35 more years. On average, however, you're not going to live 75. You're not going to live 30 more years. On average, you're going to live 17 more years. Therefore, collectively, the defined benefit plan, which works on averages, doesn't have to have that much available. It can have much less. Furthermore, let's suppose that you're now ready to retire. If you follow any sound investment advice, you're going to have a pretty conservative portfolio. You're not going to be investing in an aggressive stock portfolio because if the market goes down, there's no real opportunity to recover. In a defined benefit, so therefore you have to have a conservative portfolio. In a defined benefit plan, however, the population goes from young to old, and therefore the entire portfolio can be much better balanced, can indeed afford to take much greater risks than any single individual can take. Furthermore, the data indicate that defined benefit plans are more professionally managed, and therefore the administrative costs tend to be considerably lower. So the point is, according to at least one study, the defined benefit plans are 46% less costly, are 46%, say more efficient than the defined contribution plans. Now, as I said, the defined contribution plans are associated primarily with state and local governments. And here's the bad news. The bad news is that state and local governments, their plans on average are only about 76% funded. Now, this goes up to 2010. When it comes to getting information about the status, the funding status of state and local governments, you're always going to be a couple of years behind because they don't value their portfolios, they don't value the plans necessarily every year. So on average today, they are underfunded, 75% funded. Anything less than 80% is worrisome. Then, of course, we have some real basket cases. For example, if you look at funding by particular states, Illinois is, of course, one of the worst, 46% funded. Our neighbors to the north, Oklahoma, the yellow is the bad ones, by the way, 58% funded. Our neighbor to the east, only, 50% or 56% funded. Surprisingly, your home state, my home state, New York, doing very well, 102% funded. And that's because they use a certain funding mechanism. They use a certain actuarial cost method, which results in them being well funded. Pardon? What's the funding what? Oh, I meant to say, we're in great shape here. I'm sorry. Texas, 83% funded. Yeah, so for those of you who are in TRS, don't lose any sleep. You're in great shape. You don't have to worry. But, of course, as bad as the states are, some of our cities are even in worse condition. New York City, over here, 60% funded. Chicago, well, you know what Chicago is. That's 35% funded. Texas, Houston, which has had a lot of pension problems, they're recovering nicely. They're up to about 78% now. Philadelphia, 48%. So the point is that our state and local plans are not very well funded. Then, of course, one of the problems is how do you measure the funding? And here's where the accountants come in. And the accusations have been that the financial statements simply do not give you a very meaningful measure of the underfunding status. First, let it be noted that on the balance sheets of state and local governments, they have to report virtually zero pension liability. That is to say, even if they are underfunded, drastically underfunded, that will not necessarily be reflected on the balance sheet if you looked at the financial statements of a state and local government today. Starting next year, that's going to change. The GASB has come up with an entirely new set of standards, and there will be entirely different measures of the pension funds. Now, what I want to emphasize, though, is this. The GASB may change the rules. The GASB, by the way, is the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. That's the board that sets the rules for the accounting standards for state and local governments. And it's a board in which I happen to be a member of. But changing the rules merely changes what's reported on the balance sheet. It doesn't change the promises. The promises are the same. They're unaffected by how the government tells the story, how it measures it. So the new rules are simply going to give you perhaps a better measure, but it's not going to really change the substantive liability. But what's going to happen now is that these new measurement rules will increase the unfunded liability, which has been reported on notes, if not in the balance sheet. The unfunded liabilities will have to be reported on the balance sheet. And here's the thing, so there's been a lot written about that as how it's going to affect cities and states. What has not been widely reported is how it's going to affect smaller governments, and particularly governments like school districts. School districts, for the most part, have balanced budgets, and the trustees think that their assets are their assets exceed their liabilities. When these new rules go into effect, they're going to be in for a rude shock. Why is that? Because these school districts are members of what we call cost-sharing plans. That is to say, they all combine, together, they're all in, say, a state plan. And the plan combines the populations of all of the employees of the school districts. Up until now, the only thing they reported on their balance sheet was the difference between the contribution that this state, usually it's a state plan, the difference between what the state told them they should contribute and what they did contribute. And since most of them contributed what they had to contribute, they reported no liability. Now, under the new rules, they're going to have to report their proportionate shares of any unfunded liability. So in other words, if the state plan is underfunded by 20%, as most of them are, all of a sudden they're going to have to report 20% of that unfunded liability. For many school districts, that's going to be a huge, huge amount. And I guarantee when they see that, there's going to be some change in behavior. And trustees and others are going to be absolutely shocked when they see their revised financial statements. Even today, though, those new rules have become have been exceedingly controversial. The main area of disagreement has to do with the discount rate. What I mean by that is this. The way accountants figure this is they figure how much money is necessary when a person retires. Let's say a person is going to retire at 62. So they figure out how much do you have to have at this point in order to make the future payments. And the way they figure that is they discount the payments back to this point over here, and they so that takes into account the time value of money. That is to say, what they can earn on their investments. Then they discount it back to the present day, again using a discount rate. Well, without getting into all the mechanics and the specifics about this, let's just say this, that the higher the discount rate, the lower will be the reported liability. The lower the discount rate, the higher will be the liability. And what the current rules and what the new rules say is that the discount rate should largely be based on the amount that the pension plan can earn on its investments. So that if it can earn 8% on its investments, then it should use a discount rate of 8%. The accusation has been that that rate is inappropriately high. And here's where the financial economists will say one thing, and the actuarial community will say another thing, and the accounting community still says something else. But the point that I want to make is this, that if you pick up the papers, read in the press, very often they'll say that that what's going to be reported on the balance sheet is misleading because the discount rate is too high. As a member of the GASB, I would defend what we've done and say, there are multiple sides to this issue. Well, here's the question. Look, we know that there's real problems with respect to pension funds with state and local governments. And the question is, what can be done about it? What sorts of reforms are reasonable? And in my mind, there are certain reforms that are reasonable. However, let's keep in mind this, that if there's a reform that's going to save the government money, more than likely, almost certainly, that's going to mean less overall compensation for the employees. So what's good for the government is not good for the employees. In my view, at least, one has to view this from a perspective of the entire compensation that's offered to the employees. Now, the conventional wisdom is that government employees have far better benefits than those in the private sector. And that's correct. They do. However, when it comes to compensation in its entirety, the evidence is that government employees are not as well paid as those in the private sector. Now, this, of course, depends on certain levels. At the lesser skill levels, government employees probably are compensated higher than their counterparts in the private sector. At the higher levels, that simply is not true. I mean, it's pretty obvious. If you were to look at somebody like an accountant who is the head of the governmental accountability, the Government Accountability Office, the Controller General, I don't know what his salary is. It's probably $300,000. A mid-range partner of any CPA firm is earning considerably more than that. This was brought home to me when I was teaching at the LBJ school recently. One of the students in my class was a young major in the Army. And I said to him, I was trying to make the point that generals who have this extraordinary responsibility are not paid very much. So I said to him, how much does General Petraeus earn? And his comment was, I really don't know, but he earns less than his translator, who is a private contractor. So what sort of reforms are reasonable? Well, certainly we can eliminate spiking. What is spiking? Spiking is when an employee earns, when an employee's pension is based on, let's say, his last year of service. So what's typical? Very often police officers and firefighters and others will work in extraordinary amounts of overtime, skip their vacations, the final year of their employment. As a result, their pension is based on their last year of compensation, and very often their pension is therefore far higher than anything they've ever earned during their career. Maybe you want to increase the retirement age, perhaps to 65. What I mean by that is, in many governments, many cities, for example, an employee will start working at age 25. They'll retire with full benefits at age 45, 20 years later. And then they'll start drawing their pension immediately. Well, maybe you should say, all right, we'll give you your pension, but you can't start drawing it until you're 65. Maybe we should change the formulas to require more years of service, require employees to make more contributions, put a cap on eligible income. The most talked about reform, though, is to simply switch to defined contribution plans. As I indicated, that's not a very efficient way to do things. The defined contribution plans are less efficient than the current defined benefit plans. But what you could do, and I think this perhaps makes sense, and I might say I thought about this myself, and I mentioned it to somebody who managed the retirement system in a neighboring state, and what she told me is, she referred me to a paper by somebody at the Brookings Institute, which said basically exactly this. And what this would be is, if you can have defined contribution plans, maintain separate accounts for each employee, just like we do now, so that the money is portable. But then invest all the money in a common pool, and thereby minimizing that market risk and reducing administrative costs. And then finally, require that all benefits are in the form of an annuity. That is, you can't take it out all in one lump sum, and that will reduce that longevity risk that I talked about. In other words, now we'd be able to talk about that. We'd be able to average the expected lifespan of people. Another thing that's pretty obvious, it seems to me, is we should require people to opt out of a plan rather than to opt in. The psychologists tell us that if you require people to opt out, if you give them a choice, whether opt in or opt out, if you make them opt out, then fewer will take advantage of that option than if you give them the opportunity to opt in. Well, I've spoken about the pensions. That's only half the bad news. What's much worse with respect to cities and states is unfunded liabilities for health care, what we call other post-employment benefits, OPEB. Now, the overall liabilities, the overall cost, I should say, for health care is nowhere near that of pensions. However, traditionally over the years, governments have funded their pensions. By contrast, they have not funded their health care obligations. In other words, they're on a pay-as-you-go basis. They have not put aside any money to fund the health care that they're responsible for their retirees. And worse than that, none of that, no liability for that, has been reported on their balance sheets. That's all going to change in the next few years. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board is currently working on a pronouncement, should come out within the next year, which will require them to book their liabilities for health care. And these liabilities are going to be greater than those for the pensions. And that's because they haven't been putting aside any money. Well, let's then turn to Social Security. And what's the outlook there? First of all, let's note that Social Security is a very important source of income. Obviously, for poorer people, lower income people, it's more important than for the wealthier. So for people who earn, let's say, 25% of the national average, who have, now this is career earnings, this is career Social Security earnings. So this is the amount that they've earned, that they've averaged over their lifetime. But the replacement rate is 77%. In other words, Social Security will replace only 77% of their income, a substantial amount. For those who earn more, for let's say at the national average, it will replace 41% of their Social Security average earnings. Social Security, as you can imagine, is a huge liability for the federal government. Federal government currently has a net reported net position, a negative net position of approximately $17 trillion. Social insurance, for various reasons, is not booked as a liability on the federal government's balance sheet. And there are sound reasons for that. However, on a page immediately following the balance sheet, there's a statement of social insurance which indicates that the liability for social insurance, this is Social Security and Medicare, and a few other minor things like railroad retirement, currently, depending how you measure it, is either $40 trillion or $53 trillion. So, in other words, we're going from 17 trillion to add another 40 trillion or 53 trillion, depending on how you measure it. Now, here's something that's interesting. Some of you who can see these numbers might notice this, that in 2009, the liability, the obligation for social insurance was 45 trillion. 2013, it's 39 trillion. In fact, it dropped from 45 trillion to 30 trillion between 2009 and 2010. How could that possibly be? Here's the answer. These projections are based on current law. Now, nobody believes today that current law with respect to health care is sustainable. In fact, as I say, I emphasize this is based on current law because that's what's required. The trustees of Social Security and the trustees of Medicare, I should say, in their report, in their annual report, say that these numbers are unreasonable. This schedule is included in the financial statements of the federal government, and the auditor of the federal government, the GAO, qualifies their opinion on this schedule and says, we've incorporated it because that's the way we have to measure it, but these numbers are unreasonable. So in other words, you can probably add a few $1 trillion to those liabilities. The Social Security liability, by the way, that's about, that by itself is about $12 trillion. Now, what's the outlook? Well, starting about a year or so ago, Social Security started to bring in less than it pays out. Social Security has a trust fund. According to current projections, in the year 2033, that's when Social Security will, the Social Security trust fund will be exhausted. And notice, here's the line that shows the outflows. Here's the line that shows the inflows. And right over here, 2033, that's when the lines crossed, as I said, about a year or two ago. And in 2033, that's when the trust fund runs out of money. Now, let's make it clear what that trust fund contains. That trust fund contains investments in what? U.S. government bonds, U.S. government securities. So, from the standpoint of the U.S. government consolidated, combined, there's no trust fund at all. And right now, with revenues less than expenditures, effectively we're funding part of Social Security with actual government operating revenues. In other words, our taxes. Medicare, you got the same sort of problem. That's going to run out by 2026. And again, look at the line comparing the inflows with the outflows. Medicare Part D and D, you don't have trust funds for that, but still note that the gap is widening between inflows and outflows, and this gap represents the need to transfer from the general fund. Well, what sort of condition is the federal government in? Well, unfortunately, not great. Here again, the annual report, and this is in the handout, which I hope you'll take a look at. Here's the line of total spending, including interest. This line over here. Here's the line of revenues. Notice this is widening substantially. And of course, the main reason why it's widening is because interest charges are increasing. Where's the federal, what does the federal government spend its money on? Notice, most of the money goes to Social Security, Medicare, defense, veterans, interest. Only 19% goes for discretionary spending. That's where the cuts can be made. That's it. And that's a problem. In other words, some of you may say, I think we give too much foreign aid. I think we give too much foreign aid to Israel, Egypt, whatever. Fine. Cut out the entire State Department. Cut out the entire State Department. You're reducing expenditures by 1.47%. You don't like, 0.7%. 0.7%. You don't like the Energy Department, like our governor? Good, cut it out. Cut out the entire department, you've reduced expenditures by 1.47%. So there's not much flexibility in our system. The debt, of course, as you might expect, is increasing dramatically. So what's my point? I mean, my point is that I'm not advocating cuts in Social Security, but the fact of the matter is that politically, it's going to be very, very difficult to increase Social Security. And as we've seen, retirees are not exactly living extremely well. But you can't expect in the near future, owing to political pressures, fiscal pressures, you can't expect any great increases in Social Security. What sort of Social Security reforms are feasible? There are some. You can increase the retirement age. Yeah, that's a great idea. The trouble is, so now people will work till, say, 67 or 70, and they'll be now taking away the jobs from people who are, 20. That's not a great solution. You can switch to how the cost of living adjustments are made. Well, that's just a reduction in benefits then. You can increase the number of years over which average earnings are calculated. That's a technical adjustment, but again, that results in nothing more than a decrease in benefits. You can increase the cap on wages. That's a pretty good idea. You can go from what is it now, 117,000 to say 215,000. That's been a suggestion that's widely that's been popularized. Yeah, the trouble is, now you're going to be increasing, let's say the Social Security tax combined on employees and employers is 12%. So now you're going to be increasing the tax on people who earn between $100,000 and $200,000. Let's say you increase the cap to $215,000, which is commonly suggested. So now you're increasing the tax, effectively, you're putting a tax of about 12%, an additional tax of about 12% on the earnings of people with between $100,000 and $200,000. I guarantee that people who earn between $100,000 and $200,000, don't think of themselves as particularly wealthy. Well, that just looks at, as I said, the financial aspect, the direct financial aspects. But in our country, we've got other concerns. Our education system is not exactly terrific. Our infrastructure is falling apart. It's easy to say that people should save. Sure. But we've seen that wages, real wages in this country, have decreased considerably over the last 30 years. We talk about the elderly at age 65. Well, life expectancy is increasing, so now people who are approaching retirement have elderly parents. People who should be putting away money for their retirement have to worry about putting their kids through college. And then finally what we're seeing, and this I get from personal observation of friends, that the kids who have left and graduated from college are now coming back and they have to be supported. So what's the answer? I hate to leave on a pessimistic note, and I won't. The fact of the matter is that what we need to do ultimately is to improve our economy. That's the ultimate answer. And if somehow we can get our economy going, that, it seems to me, will solve the rest of the problems. So with that, why don't we open it up for discussion and questions? I might add that, Jeremy, in your introduction, you omitted the most salient part, which is you should have noted that I'm a tenured professor at the university. Therefore, I have no accountability, no responsibility, and therefore I think there'll be a lot of comments. Well, I'm going to perform. The question is, what sector of the economy do you think can be most improved upon or is more readily improved upon, right? Well, I'm going to give you a very self-serving answer. I think we've got to improve education. That if we indeed improve our educational system, that's critical to maintaining a strong economy. And what we have to hope for is that there'll be some new paradigm. Computers boosted us through in the 1970s. I'm optimistic. I think there'll be some new paradigm that comes along. But what it is, who knows? Yes.
Of the items that you listed as recommendations on things we can do to improve the longevity of Social Security, you mentioned chain CPI, you mentioned raising the retirement age, and 3 or 4 others. Will switching or implementing the chain CPI alone be sufficient to reduce the challenge that Social Security had? Or is it a case of, will introducing higher retirement ages alone be sufficient?
No.
Or is it going to be a combination?
It's going to be a combination of them. For example, let me just, reducing the with chain CPI, changing the way the cost of living is measured, will have a very minor effect. I forget the number, it's like 3% or something. Moving the cap from 117 to 215 will reduce the amount by 36%, the unfunded amount.
All right. Thank you very much.
But that doesn't help you very much, does it?
No.
And by the way, I mean, in an economy that's not very vibrant, the last thing you want to do is reduce benefits one way or another. Yes?
Can you talk about means testing? I think you skipped that one when you were going over the list. Do you think that's a viable contributor to making Social Security?
Oh yes, that's certainly a possibility. But again, that's politically difficult. People like me say, "Hey, I've contributed into Social Security all these years, and now you're taking it away from me."
But I think I read a number. I don't remember the number, but I think I read a statistic that indicated that current retirees are taking out much more than they ever put in, even adjusted for, even including interest earned on that money that was held all those years.
I think you're right. I mean, look, I got to tell you, I'm collecting Social Security, and I don't need it. For me, it pays for trips to the grandchildren. But so yes, that's certainly a viable proposal. But again, taxing the rich typically doesn't provide that much money. That's the problem, because there just aren't that many rich.
You talked about OPEB costs. When will we know?
OPEB is other post-employment benefits, right?
When will we know how the effects of the Federal Affordable Care Act may have some impact on the whole national economy or OPEB costs in the long term?
I have no idea. That's way beyond my field.
Will you wager a guess at all if it was the right call to make? To attack that one particular issue as a major portion of our economy, and whether or not it'll spur economic protection or growth?
No, I don't want to get into that one. I can only get myself in trouble on that one. But I mean, look, your point is well taken, though. It's a tough issue.
Paul Krugman says that we're headed for an oligarchy economy with most of it inherited wealth. And how can we possibly increase our economy in general with the wealth being concentrated in legacies to families?
Well, that's a good point. And that was Krugman's column, I guess, last week in the New York Times. And for those of you who didn't read it, what he demonstrated was that among billionaires, they are now in a position to bequeath their fortunes to their children, and there's relatively little tax on that today. What he says is that he made the point that that's going to cause real problems in the economy, because these people suddenly have wealth and they really haven't earned it. And they have, with wealth, of course, goes considerable power. And he cites some examples like how do you pronounce it, Koch brothers? He gives Krugman cites that as an example. Yes.
My question is sort of related to the last point. It seems like, given that incomes have stagnated or gone down, has anybody looked at the impact of, let's say, raising the minimum wage to like $15 per hour, which would, in a sense, increase the amount of income going into the Social Security fund through those payroll taxes?
Oh, there's no question. That's a hot issue today. That's a very controversial issue, and the economists are divided on that. Now, it's which economists you believe. Some believe that increasing the minimum wage will indeed increase the spending of lower earning workers. Others believe that it will reduce employment. And again, I leave that one to the economists, and even they can't tell you. There's just considerable mixed evidence on that one.
Has there been analysis of converting Social Security into insurance against penury, in the sense that everyone would pay Social Security and you would be guaranteeing or insuring yourself against, in retirement, receiving less than $50,000 a year, let's say, from all of your sources of income? And only people who do not have $50,000 or more or less would receive Social Security, and everybody else, as you, in your particular case, and many in this room probably, really is an excess income, excess income, which really isn't needed, converted into an insurance policy against poverty.
I'm sure that's been proposed.
Have you analyzed what the implications would be for the Social Security fund?
No, I haven't looked at that at all. That's an interest. That would dramatically change Social Security, I take it, right?
That's how Roosevelt sold it. That's the original way. The original Social Security Act.
Is that right? So it's something to think about. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, you've worried me a bit, or a lot actually, when you mentioned changing in the accounting or the rules for state and local governments going into effect next year. Just the effects of that on the municipal bond market, where you have these general obligation, supposedly the highest rated municipal bonds out there are suddenly going to be stressed. And it's going to take a lot of money out of the ratings come down, people lose money. It's going to take a lot of money out of municipal bond market. Is that? I mean, that seems like a further fear as far as the again from a state and local standpoint.
That's a great question, and the issue then is, if we now provide a better measure of the liability, will the bond market react to that? And in fact, let me just say this. Within the last week, the GASB voted not to delay the implementation of those new rules because state and local governments petitioned for a delay. Now, what they were concerned about, by the way, was that they would get a qualified audit opinion. What we heard from the bond rating agencies is that it wouldn't matter. Now you think about that. The bond rating agencies, they have the power, they have the authority to demand any information they can. And in fact, Moody's doesn't use the measurements that are incorporated in the financial statements. They remeasure the liability themselves. So presumably the rating agencies are already taking that into account. And one would think that changing the accounting rules would have no impact on the bond market. That's good theory. Whether it will in practice is hard to say. In the corporate sector, that's what we accountants do for a living. Study those sorts of things. Like, what effect will a change in reporting have on stock prices? There have been very few studies in the bond market, though, but it's an excellent issue, for sure.
We have time for one more question. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you so much for coming.